So we have with us Amitabh Behar, Executive Director of National Foundation for India. So we have the IRBF index has been released, and it basically tells us how good are our companies, top 100 companies, with respect to the policies they have for their employees and for those who work with in the supply chain. Can you tell us how are our companies good interested in being more transparent? Are they willing to disclose that information, or are they still quite
Okay.
yeah?
So I would say that first, if you look at the report itself, the report is largely reporting on the mandatory
Yeah.
aspects of disclosure.
Yeah.
And it's looking at a whole range of issues, including social inclusion, which is, say, diversity in the workforce, then labor standards, then there are certain other questions about environmental standards, and this is largely taken from the voluntary guidelines, which the business sector has made for itself so that they ensure responsible business. So it's a fairly comprehensive, I would even say ambitious idea that you're benchmarking yourself vis-a-vis certain core values. So that's the ambition and that's the aspiration. But to respond to your question, I would say that most of them fall short of actually responding to the aspiration. And one of the big conclusions of this report is that only where it's by law mandatory, there is greater compliance. But we also heard, on the other hand, there are huge violations, even in terms of which I think is law of the land, say minimum wages.
Right.
So some companies are not, and we are talking about the top 100 companies. Even in that, people don't pay minimum wages, which ranges from 150 rupees to 250 rupees a day. So I would say that it's a long journey. Such initiatives of the business sector to create that voluntary framework is a positive step. But I think then the civil society needs to step in, the way this report steps in, both in disclosing. It's like putting the spotlight on the businesses to see how they are performing.
Also, one of the guests there at the panel had said that instead of just giving out those 100 companies and say what they do and what they don't, is it better if you pinpoint them and say that these companies have not been compliant and sort of in a way name and shame them?
Sure.
Yeah. Is that is that a better way?
I would say that I do a lot of advocacy work.
Yeah.
And in advocacy, one of the primary principles is that there's no one way of doing advocacy. This report in itself is of high value.
Yeah.
As Pradeep from Praxis said, that ultimately the attempt is to bring this information in the public domain. And then there can be different kinds of groups. An activist group which works on, say, minimum wages could and should pick that particular aspect, and they should even then name and shame and have their struggle around those specific companies. So that's absolutely fine. But I'm just making a distinction that this report is doing its job.
Yeah.
But then other actors, including the state actors, need to get their act together and push for the ambitions that we have talked of.
So even when I look at the index,
Yeah.
and I see more public sector companies being more compliant than private ones, do you believe, what can we do to ensure that private has also make sure that they're compliant? Do you think, or this because for critics, they think that this is just rhetoric, which won't help us in getting anywhere.
Yeah.
Companies will continue to be non-compliant, and
So I would say that, again, it's a mixed set of strategies that we need. You're right that in the entire spectrum, I would say that there would be several companies which do believe in these core principles, and they don't see it as rhetoric, but they do not have the systems and processes to reach there. We need to have those dialogues and help them in reaching that stage. But you're also right that on the other end of the spectrum, there would be several companies which certainly would not want to adhere to these norms. And there it is really what you had earlier said, the naming, shaming, building public pressure, using public laws, that would work. So it's a mix of strategies, but I think we certainly need to have much greater awareness in the public domain. People need to understand that businesses have a higher responsibility than just making profits.
Right. So even again, when I look at the index, you have various companies. You have pharmaceutical companies, you have Coal India, a lot of public
Sure,
sector companies. Do you find any such sector that's failing or succeeding? Which sector is doing better and which sector isn't?
So that this response is not based on the report.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So the report clearly says PSUs are doing better than the private companies. So that's coming from the report. But my understanding, having connected with a lot of other corporate groups, is that it is the IT industry which does better than, say, the extractives. So those would be the two ends. The IT industry is much better in most of the compliances, whereas the extractive industry is not performing well around many of these indicators.
Is that mostly because they have a larger supply chain?
It is part to do with the nature of their work. So when say you're in mining, you are also into displacing.
Yeah.
We still do not have technologies which are completely environment friendly. And then it's also to do with the norms within the sector. These are old industries in many ways, and they've worked with even slave labor earlier. So those norms have carried on, and compared to that, the IT industries are founded more on say, I would say, a modern platform, including of values, and therefore probably they're better.
All right. So where do you see? I mean, by the time the next index comes out, are you optimistic about companies doing better?
So to be honest, as in if you read the previous year's report and this year's report, I would say that that's pretty much a replica of previous year's report. And in such processes, 1 year is a fairly short time. This is not to say that we should not do the report annually, because it's very important to shine that light on the good performing and the bad performing companies. But you'll not see a significant shift until unless there's an external impetus to it. And that's where I think, some of the questions that came up during the conversation about how would you use this report? Have you actually seen people do litigation based on this report? Have trade unions used it for compliance? Those are questions that we need to hear more seriously, and then start, trying to seed some of those ideas. I think that will then start moving the discourse.
So that would mean looking beyond the top 100 companies.
I'm saying looking beyond the idea that information in the public domain in itself would lead to accountability. Start taking actions of multiple kinds which would create both a climate for greater accountability, but also for enforcement of the accountability norms which are part of our legal system, or at least part of the voluntary disclosure systems.
All right, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you for your
Thanks.
comments.
Thanks.